to our Hillary. This is our third event, correct?
It is.
Oh my goodness, we're veterans at this point. So yeah, welcome everyone back to the Lehman Center for American History. And I don't know, and everyone can hear me okay as well? I guess we're doing well. Yeah, okay, thank you. My name is Samuel Roberts. I am one of the co-directors of the Lehman Center, along with my colleague Hillary Hallett. Welcome to our third event of the semester and the first semester of the LCAH's relaunch. This is part of the series of book talks that we're doing here at the Lehman Center for American History. Last month, we kicked off the season of events with a powerful lecture from the distinguished attorney, activist, and author Andrea Ritchie, speaking about her latest book, Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. That event, I know it was recorded, and I believe it should be available on YouTube. If not now, then imminently. We'll be putting, and I think we'll get Nikita to put the link to the chat, or a link to the recording in the chat room. Today, we're delighted to welcome Martha Jones to hear about her latest book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and insisted on equality for all. Before I introduce Dr. Jones, I'd like to say a quick word about the Lehman Center and the context that led us to select the scholars whom we are hosting this fall. The Lehman Center for American History is a collaboration between the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Columbia University and the Columbia University Department of History, and is dedicated to supporting and enhancing the study and teaching of history here at Columbia. After closing temporarily for renovations to our physical location in the International Affairs Building, the Lehman Center has reopened during what can only be called a truly historical moment in the United States. Today, we find ourselves grappling with three intersecting crises. First, of course, is the impending presidential election, in which the most basic democratic rights like voting and the peaceful transition of power seem to be under threat. A devastating pandemic that has now claimed over 200,000 lives and has disproportionately impacted Latinx and African Americans, also ranks among the many crises that we face in this year. And of course, perhaps the unprecedented uprising and reckoning over police violence and racial injustice and structural racism. All the historians here at the Lehman Center, and by the way, this also includes our good colleagues Ty Jones and Nikita Shepard. Ty Jones is our associate director. We all believe it's our responsibility to use the research that we do and the scholarship with which we are engaged to confront these historic crises by talking to authors who help us understand how we got there and where we're going today, and also to help us clarify what strategies we may employ moving forward. We are so very excited that the public events sponsored by the Lehman Center this year engage our current crises with three overlapping series. The first is a series of lectures organized by Professor Hallett by myself rather. I skipped a line ahead, I'm sorry. Principally by myself, of course, with the assistance of Nikita Shepard on race, health, and inequality. Last month, we co-organized a powerful discussion with Dr. Harriet Washington at the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, and that video, I believe, is also available on the Weeksville site. And it concerned the legacy of African American health inequities and what they tell us today about COVID-19. On November 18th, we'll have the second author, Marcia Chatelain, whose book on Black fast food franchise owners sheds important light on race, health, economics, and is in many ways sets the stage for other issues in food justice. We're looking forward to that again. That's November the 18th. This semester, the Lehman Center for American History has also organized two series of new book talks on Thursday afternoons. The Andrea Ritchie talk kicked off our Policing America series that the Lehman Center will be running all year. Given the larger racial reckoning at this moment, we felt that it was essential to highlight critical scholarship on the history of policing and resistance in the United States to help us understand the origins of the crisis that led to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many thousands more at the hands of law enforcement. On Thursday, November 5th, we'll welcome Simon Balto, who will discuss his powerful book on policing Black Chicago, titled Occupied Territory. And please look for more talks in the spring as we continue our conversations with historians who help us understand our current carceral crisis. Today's talk by Martha Jones connects with the second theme of the new books we are looking at this semester. We are calling this series, or this sub-series, American Politics, American Identities. The authors we will hear from all engage the many different ways that ethnicity and race have structured political participation in the United States. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which, so the story goes, granted women in the United States the right to vote. But not all women. Jones's critical account reshapes our understanding of the history of women's suffrage, social movements, African-American politics, gender, and the public sphere in 19th and 20th centuries United States. It cannot come at a more timely moment, of course, when Black women's lives and activism have moved to the center, and I would actually add moved the center of American political discourse from the Black Lives Matter movement and to the vice presidential race and all points in between. So we are honored to have the opportunity to welcome Professor Martha Jones to Columbia, re-welcoming her again, by the way, as her previous book, Martha, I'm looking over in this direction. This is where your image is on the screen. So just pretend that I'm actually looking. Everyone can imagine I'm looking right at her. Your previous book was also featured in the lineup at the Lehman Center for American History. So I want to welcome you back. Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. In addition to her latest work that she discusses today, she's the author of the award-winning Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America from 2018, and All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African-American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900 from the year 2007. She's also a co-editor of the fabulous collection anthology Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women from 5 years ago, and also is the author, of course, of many important articles and essays. Professor Jones is a public historian, frequently writing for broader audiences at the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time Magazine. She has also curated museum exhibitions and museum film and video productions as well. Prior to the start of her academic career, Professor Jones was a public interest litigator here in New York City, recognized for her work as the Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. And Martha, actually, I don't think I knew that you were a Revson Fellow. I was a faculty advisor to that program. It must have been after you were here, but I have a great admiration for that program when it was here at Columbia. Professor Jones currently serves as a co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, also known as the Berks, and on the executive board of the Society of American Historians. Please join me and the LCAH team in welcoming Professor Martha Jones to this afternoon's discussion. Thank you so much, Martha.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks to you, and of course to Hillary and everyone at the Lehman Center for inviting me back. The work you do is so important, but I want to underscore, in addition to all the important substantive questions that you all are helping us to understand better, to think through, and to act on. I, for one, am just grateful for the fellowship and the convening and the opportunity to see you all, even if it is on the Zoom, as we endure these many months of distance. So thank you for that as well. And I'm going to jump in. Mentioned to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and you might notice that I cringe a bit. Don't get me wrong, as Sam Roberts has just noted, I've just finished a book about the history of Black women in the vote, and so I'm as interested as anyone in the anniversary and its significance to the nation's past. And still, I can't quite bring a spirit of celebration to the moment It just might get in the way of the story that I want to share with you today. When we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment fit only awkwardly with events that feature light shows and period costumes and marching bands. Members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, state lawmakers who ratified it, and suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in its terms would prohibit states from strategically using poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, and more to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand in 1920. Now, I'm a historian, and so fortunately for me, and maybe for you, nothing in my job requires me to plan commemoration festivities. Instead, my work in this year has been to cut through half-truths and myths about the past, and I hope equip us with the critical tools needed to think about the past and the future of American democracy. 25 years ago, historian Michel Rolfe-Trio looked back on the celebrations that marked 500 years since 1492, the year in which it had long been said Christopher Columbus had discovered America. Trio warned historians away from such occasions, lest we be drawn into promoting sanitized and partial truths, even myths. He knew that on that anniversary, while the myths may have filled tourist coffers, they did very little to promote critical understanding of how colonialism had devastated the people and the lands of the hemisphere. So when asked why I stayed home and away from celebrations in 2020, I note that the Centennial of the 19th Amendment marks a milestone in the story of voting rights. I add that remembering the era of voter suppression then may help us see more clearly how ballots are being withheld from Americans now. It might even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring voting rights. And I'm eager to contribute the stories of Black women to our collective understandings of the 19th Amendment. And still as a nation, we are not yet ready for that grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still remains out on the horizon. I want to start, if I could, just by reminding us about, I think, two myths that certainly you've heard over the course of this year, and Sam Roberts has already sort of alluded to this. The first is that when the amendment became law in 1920, that all American women won the vote. You may even hear people put it this way, right? The 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. That's a first myth. There's a second one, however, that almost runs contrary to the first. And the second one is that no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept Black women from the polls. I hear that one, frankly, as often as I do the first. So my work this year is to drill in a little bit of this history. And I want to start with just reminding us about the terms of the 19th Amendment. It's ratified in August of 1920, and it goes like this. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Well, now laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. That's clear. And still, the 19th Amendment did not promise any woman the vote. State laws still kept women from the polls based upon age, citizenship, residency, mental competence. In 1920, it was still true that American women who married non-US citizens lost their citizenship and hence the right to vote. So even as women showed up to register in the fall of 1920, they continued to confront hurdles. Now, one additional barrier to women's votes persisted even after a federal amendment, and that was anti-Black racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870, a half century before, had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the South and in the West had set in place hurdles that, while silent about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had kept Black men from casting ballots since the 1890s. Along with that, unchecked intimidation, the threat of lynching, and its fact sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became merely equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and the 19th Amendment. Registration numbers reflected the effect of these discriminatory laws. And in the fall of 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found the books closed. And still, the first waves of Black women voters had been unleashed years before as individual states made women's suffrage the law, importantly for Black women in California starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, and New York in 1917. Black women were already experienced voters by 1920. And the 19th Amendment permits still other Black women to join them. My first example comes from St. Louis, Missouri, where we learned some about how Black women engage the ground game of politics in 1920 to overcome the hurdles that are in front of them. In St. Louis, Black women organized under the auspices of the city's YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, and there they ran a suffrage school. They prepared one another how to pay a poll tax, how to pass a literacy test. They read the Constitution together in order to be able to explain its most complex provision to registrars when confronted. And then they turned out en masse with one another in an effort to deflect intimidation, to deflect violence. And if the newspapers are a good gauge of what happened in St. Louis, they reported that nearly every woman in the city registered in the fall of 1920, Black women and white alike. Now, for Black women, registration is not merely an exercise in affirming the terms of the 19th Amendment. It is not merely a moment of women's political empowerment. Black women are registering and organizing in St. Louis because in that city, starting in 1916, local officials are using ballot referenda to set in place a housing segregation regime that still plagues the city of St. Louis until today. So what Black women know is that in 1916, their fathers, their husbands had turned out in an attempt to defeat a new segregation ordinance. They had been intimidated to the degree that they had literally been arrested at the polls on trumped up false charges. Black women in St. Louis are there, yes, to exercise their right to vote as women, to breathe life into the terms of the 19th Amendment as women, but their purpose is also simultaneously to defeat the growing influence of racism and Jim Crow in their city. In contrast, let's look at Daytona, Florida, where educator and club organizer Mary McLeod Bethune had been traveling the state all throughout 1920, encouraging Black women to ready themselves for that moment when the 19th Amendment opened the door to registering. They were confronted, Bethune and her colleagues were confronted by brutal opposition each step along the way, an organized campaign of terroristic violence that plagued Black voting rights activists in Florida in 1920 and Mrs. Bethune in particular. On Election Day, eve of 1920, we realize that Mrs. Bethune has won a reputation as a voting rights activist, so much so that the Ku Klux Klan organizes to gather in downtown Daytona. The Klansmen, these are men on horseback in full regalia. They just burned a cross in the adjacent river, and they march onto the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's Girls Industrial School in Daytona, today's Bethune-Cookman University, in an effort to intimidate her, certainly, but to intimidate her faculty and more broadly the Black women of Daytona, again on the eve of Election Day. The next day, the Black women of Daytona do indeed turn out to cast their ballots. Like Black women in St. Louis, they do so in numbers, they do so in groups, they do so en masse in an effort to deflect the violence. And they are, we might say, successful in 1920. But by 1922, the violence has been persistent enough, brutal enough. The Klan will again, on election eve, visit Mrs. Bethune's school. And after that election season, she will turn her work away from that ground game of politics and come to Washington to do an end run around the voter suppression that she was encountering in the state of Florida. So it's 1920, and Black women are facing a remarkable dilemma, one that requires them now to strategize about a next phase, we might say even a wholly new movement for voting rights that begins rather than ends in the fall of 1920. Black women are organized, many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, under the auspices of the National Association of Colored Women. And there, Hallie Quinn Brown is president, and Brown is charged, in essence, with leading the charge forward for Black women. She had began her life as an educator, trained as an elocutionist at the Chautauqua Institution. By the early 20th century, she had headed the suffrage department of the NACW, was an AME church activist where she strained to hold office against the opposition of male ministers. In 1920, she is at the helm of the National Association of Colored Women. And the organization sets its sight now on securing federal legislation that would give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments, legislation that would, in essence, override the state laws that are promising to keep Black women from the polls. Brown needs a strategy, and she has it in her mind that perhaps the women whose political savvy and effectiveness, women like Alice Paul, the head of the National Women's Party, the women who have won the 19th Amendment, she has it in mind that perhaps Paul will now join forces with African-American women now that she has the 19th Amendment in hand and help now to secure voting rights for all American women. She calls upon Alice Paul in the winter of 1921, entreaties Paul to join with Black women. And while the words they exchanged have not survived, what we do know is that by that winter, Alice Paul will begin to fold up the National Women's Party. And by 1923, she will have moved on to champion a new constitutional amendment, the still with us Equal Rights Amendment. And in essence, African-American women will be left, if you will, to now partner with African-American men in new movement for voting rights. That movement will have three prongs. Black women will continue to work the ground game in every election cycle as they can, when they can. Some of the earliest, best examples come out of the city of Chicago, where Black women will become not only voters, operatives in the Republican Party, will send Oscar DePriest, the first Black man to be elected to Congress since Reconstruction, to Washington in 1928. This is the ground game that Black women continue to play in this new movement. In addition to this, there is the legal campaign waged principally by the NAACP, whether it is litigation or lobbying. The NAACP chips away at the edifice of Jim Crow and voter suppression, challenging poll taxes, grandfather clauses, challenging whites-only primaries in this period. The third prong, of course, is that which gains traction in the 1940s and will take us all the way to 1965. And in that year, the signing into law of the Voting Rights Act. This is the grassroots social movement work of the modern civil rights era that will include women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Septima Clark, Diane Nash, Ella Baker. These women and the hundreds and thousands of other Black women who put their lives, their livelihoods, and more on the front lines in a mass movement that culminates in the forcing of the hand of figures like Lyndon Johnson and the Congress in 1965, a movement that takes them across 45 years until the Voting Rights Act in 1965 becomes law. In a year, 2020, when we are all learning profound and necessary lessons about not only the fact, but the technologies of voter suppression, it's become, I think, more urgent than ever to recount the story of African-American women's struggles after 1920. These are not stories that should be glossed through myths and half-truths. The real power of these stories in 2020 is, of course, that they are cautionary tales for our own time. And still, it is true that things have changed since 1920. The role that African-American women play in the politics of our own time was, as Michel Rolfe-Triot would have put it was the unspeakable. That is to say that the promise of the ongoing suppression of Black women's political power, including their voting rights, was the deep premise of a constitutional revolution that was the 19th Amendment. The power of Black women at the ballot box is exemplified by women in the state of Alabama in 2017 who organize, activate those same networks that Black women had been working through in 1920 there in 2017 Alabama to not only send the Democrat Doug Jones to Congress, but to flip that Senate seat from red to blue in a moment where every vote in the Senate matters. This year, I just cast my ballot at the start of the week, and many of us are beginning to scrutinize the ballots that we will cast in the coming weeks. Cumulatively, those ballots evidence the more than 120 African-American women who are running for Congress in 2020, something that was unthinkable in 1920, certainly for white Americans. It is a record-shattering number of African-American women. The high bar had been set 4 years ago in 2016 when the number of Black women running for Congress was 48. And I am someone who has turned to this particular statistic to underscore the degree to which Black women are no longer to be, if you will, relegated to the faint praise of firsts. I think these women tell us that Black women are have become a force in American politics. And if you had missed the 120 plus women, certainly you didn't miss Kamala Harris. And the significance, I think, of Senator Harris's candidacy, again, in many ways lies not in her singularity or her distinction as a first of sorts. When we remember that not so long ago, just this past summer, we were vetting her along with Vice President Biden, one of 6 Black women in that pool. That fact, those 6 women, all formidable contenders for the vice presidency in 2020, that fact tells us a great deal about how Black women have, across the last century, prepared themselves for this historical moment when perhaps finally the party is ready, perhaps the candidate is ready. It turns out that Black women like Senator Harris were more than ready. But it's also true that Senator Harris has given us an opportunity to appreciate the history that out of which she emerges. And this is indeed the history that I have endeavored to tell in Vanguard, because I think it isn't possible to fully respect, to fully regard, to fully anticipate, or to fully appreciate who Senator Harris is, what she brings to American politics. It's not possible to know that unless we understand the history out of which she comes. And back in August, during the Democratic Convention, she gave us a sort of lesson in Black women's history when she name-checked 6 women, all of whom I was thrilled to realize also appear in the pages of my book. 6 women. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and probably the most ambitious and committed Black suffragist of the early 20th century. Terrell was someone who not only led Black women toward their political aspirations, she was someone who insisted that Black women would have a seat at the national table, a seat in organizations like the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, even when anti-Black racism threatened and was mobilized to discourage Black women from maintaining their place in those politics. Kamala Harris name-checked Ida B. Wells, the journalist, great anti-lynching anti-lynching advocate, and of course, suffragist. Wells is there in those Chicago scenes that give us the Alpha Suffrage Club and the election of Oscar DePriest to Congress in 1928. She invoked Mary McLeod Bethune, the educator, suffragist, who after 1922 will begin to regroup and refashion her approach to politics. She will come to Washington in the 1930s, found the National Council of Negro Women, helped Franklin Roosevelt, found his Black cabinet, used the power of patronage to bring Black women into New Deal federal agencies and to steer the resources of those agencies toward Black communities that are still recovering from the Depression. Mrs. Bethune will go on to claim a seat in 1945 at the San Francisco meeting of the new United Nations, and there join with women of color across the globe to ensure that women's interests were baked into the foundation of the United Nations. Kamala Harris invoked 2 of the greats of the modern civil rights movement, Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer. Nash, the brilliant architect, from student sit-ins in Nashville to the Freedom Rides, and of course to the Selma campaign, where Diane Nash is behind the scenes, an architect of a brutal confrontation that forces the hand of Congress and Lyndon Johnson and helps to give us the Voting Rights Act. Diane Nash, someone who worked largely behind the scenes, contrasts importantly to Fannie Lou Hamer, former sharecropper from Mississippi, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC activist, who understood many things about American politics, including how to use the camera, both still and moving, to bring her concerns, her issue, her struggle for voting rights into the living rooms of Americans near and far during the modern civil rights era. It is Fannie Lou Hamer who will challenge the Democratic Party in 1964, taking the floor before the Credentials Committee before national television cameras to decry the party, to decry the seating of a Mississippi delegation that had been selected without the consultation, without the consent of Black Mississippians. Fannie Lou Hamer represents the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the claim that Black Americans have to a place in party politics. Kamala Harris finally invoked Constance Baker Motley. This one perhaps doesn't surprise us. They both share a vocation and a membership in a guild that is mine as well. These are Black women lawyers. Motley, of course, was a member of that NAACP litigation team, but she would go on first to run for public office in New York City, and then she would sit in the New York State legislature, and then would be appointed to the federal bench, where her life's work would become the defense of the sorts of principles, the sorts of rights, the sorts of constitutional protections that Black Americans had long struggled for. So Senator Harris, I think, tells us something not only about herself and the invocation of these women, she tells us something about the necessity of expanding and extending our insights into American women's political history, both for who she invokes and for whom she does not invoke. Nowhere in her remarks were figures like Alice Paul or Susan Anthony. Those are stories for another woman in another day. So I think with that, I'll say thank you. Thank you to the Lehman Center again for inviting me back. And I think I'm right that Hillary is going to rejoin me, and we have some time perhaps for conversation and for questions. So thank you all for the opportunity. It's really an honor to be here.
Thank you, Martha. Can you see me?
I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, if we have a lot of students here and some faculty. If folks want to put their questions for Professor Jones in the chat or just join in, that would be great. But I will get us started off. I just loved this book so much, and there's so many different aspects of it that I want to get to ask you about. But I think because we do have quite a few graduate students in the audience, I thought what we might first start off talking a little bit about was the journey of writing it for you. You know, as has already been mentioned, this is your third, you know, monograph. I know that you're, even as far back as your dissertation, you know, you were looking at African-American women's political culture. And so in a way, you know, you could say that this has its origins at the very beginning of your career, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about, you know, your journey, because this is also clearly an act in public history as well. And so, and an act of synthesis. And so it just seems like there's a lot of different strands of your career at work and at play here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's very important to say that these ideas, you know, do have an origin in my years as a graduate student, where I read Ellen Du Bois. I read Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, very importantly, and I mixed it up with, I think, graduate students who, colleagues and friends who insisted on a story of women's suffrage that not only privileged, but oftentimes valorized women like Stanton Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul. Those were good fights, and my work has stayed close to this ever since. However, you're right to, I think, frame it in part as a work of public history. This is a trade book meant to be read by a very broad readership, and that was purposeful because a few summers back, a friend shared with me the plans for a monument that was going to be unveiled in New York Central Park in August of 1920 to mark the 19th Amendment Centennial. And the initial proposal featured two women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony, with a scroll that kind of unfolded at their feet where the names of other women were proposed to be inscribed. And my alarm bells went off because I worried that we were in danger of careening into an anniversary year, right? With Cleo's, caution in my head about the way how anniversary celebrations can go very wrong. And I thought, well, if there was ever a chance for me to try and mobilize not only my own work, but really the work of, by 2017, 2018, the work with 3 generations of Black women's historians, this was my chance, right? This was a chance to pull that together and to offer an intervention into how this anniversary was going to be marked. I am happy to say that after a lot of public hearings and a lot of op-ed wars, the Central Park Monument was amended to include the figure of Sojourner Truth, and I hope folks, particularly New York folks, have seen it or will have a chance to see it very soon. So I do think that for me, the deep satisfaction has been that what the anniversary year did was prime people for new histories of women's politics, women's votes, and more. And that was unabashedly my purpose.
Right. Well, you succeeded wildly, and wonderfully in this intervention. First of all, I think we all can see the fruits of that everywhere right now in the discussion that's going on. And it brings us to a point that came up already in the questions, this idea that you are still having to so actively engage in prevalent myth busting, obviously here around the idea of what the 19th Amendment did and didn't do, but also, going back to the origins really of women's rights and the persistent myth of Seneca Falls, as Lisa Tetra's book calls it, right? But as as your work takes, you start us off in the 1810s rather, with Jarena Lee, and this very different genealogy that you develop really for women's rights. So I think if you can describe for us some more of the ways that kind of activism and political participation really laid the groundwork for human rights and women's rights.
Yeah. As Sam Roberts mentioned, I was part of a collective that included my friend and one-time dissertation committee member, Farrah Griffin, along with Mia Bay and Barbara Savage, toward an intellectual history of Black women. That project, I think, helped me recognize, if you will, the thread of intellectual history in my work. So part of how I wind up in the earliest years of the 19th century in this book is because I'm pulling a thread on a distinct set of ideas, a distinct political vision, a distinct critique that Black women, the women I'm encountering in the later 19th century and the 20th century, are all in command of, and that is the view, right, that neither race nor sex has a place in arbitrating political power, political rights. So where did that begin was sort of my question. My students, forgive me, my students think it begins in the 21st century with them. That's not quite correct. But it also doesn't begin, frankly, in the 1980s. With great thinkers like Kimberly Crenshaw, who give us intersectionality, or Patricia Hill Collins, that Black women have been practicing, thinking through, and organizing by way of that intersectional vision for a very long time. And I wind up back at the beginning of the 19th century with Jarena Lee's remarkable spiritual memoir, which speaks to the politics of church, but is, of course, so profoundly resonant across all, a broad swath of what I have come to term African-American public culture. She has lessons, she confronts dilemmas, that are shared across many spheres of public life by Black women. And she is there crafting a set of ideas, as well as a set of practices, but first ideas that undergird. And this is, I think, how we can understand why Black women persist. And that is sort of the vanguard dimension of the book, is that Black women persist in those ideas precisely because they are ideas, right? And that they reside someplace other than in the disappointments or the challengements, the discouragement, and more of real politics. They are a set of political ideals that are forged in the early decades of the 19th century, are refined, are buffed, are added to and more across the centuries. But therein lies the origin. And in this sense, I think that it took me a long time to recognize something that I didn't see in my first book. I didn't see in my early work, right, were the ways in which Black women really were the standard bearers for a vision of American politics that, with some notable exceptions, we as Americans quite easily subscribe to today. And it is Black women who bequeathed that to us, and a lonely, lonely quest that was only possible because they were also willing to build their own political movement, to build their own political sphere, rather than wedge themselves into organizations, spaces, and ideologies that were ill-fitting and that couldn't accommodate that vision.
Yeah, that comes across very powerfully. So I'm just looking at a question that we just got from Kaylin Ahong, who is asking if you would expand a bit on Black women's distinct political tradition of rejecting both race and gender to set exclusionary bounds of politics. How would you?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So part of what will distinguish Black women in this movement are certainly those ideas. There's more when it comes to ideas. By the mid-19th century, Black women are speaking and calling on women's rights and the movement for women's suffrage to speak directly to violence, including sexual violence. Some of you may have encountered along the way the rather infamous scenes of the 1860s when Stanton and Anthony and Frederick Douglass and others come back together in the American Equal Rights Association to deliberate over the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And this is a set of debates that birth the two women's suffrage associations by 1870. In that scene, as early as that scene, the Black women there are coming on the record to speak about violence. They speak specifically about the problem of transportation, about being accosted, denigrated, assaulted, and more, about the dangers that they face. And they are imploring this movement to incorporate into its central objectives, whether it's a constitutional amendment or it's legislation or it's a set of practices closer to the ground. Black women are asking the movement to speak to that, and it does not. And further, what they're telling us, what they tell us, is that the distance between Black and white women, even by the 1860s, is extraordinary. Why? Because Black women are being assaulted, ejected from ladies' cars, and white women are watching. And white women are watching. And as I began to develop sort of the biographical perspectives on many women who I thought I knew, what I discovered was that nearly every one of them had a story about violence, about men putting their hands on them in public, about the threat of sexual violence. And this is a thread that the increasingly the movement for women's votes cannot accommodate. African American women organized in the National Association of Colored Women by the 1890s rather than join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, because they are as committed to winning anti-lynching legislation as they are to winning a federal amendment that would further the interests of women's votes. Black women know that no federal amendment is going to change their place in American politics if violence and intimidation, lynching are permitted to persist. And so these are fused issues for African American women. Last piece is that Black women always continue to wage these struggles in the institutions, the organizations, the political bodies that they share with men. So in Vanguard, we spend a great deal of time in church. We start with Jarena Lee, we end with Pauli Murray, as a reminder that Black women wage the struggles for rights, for political power and more in spaces like churches, but also in anti-slavery societies, in civil rights organizations and more. And this is part of the signature. Black women's politics are practiced and lived and organized across a collection of institutions and movements. They are never reduced to any one organization, even an organization like the NACW. So I hope that goes some distance to helping you begin to see the distinct contours of the movement that Black women build for voting rights.
Yeah, I was really struck too with the way that conflict, harassment, the threat of constant violence came up over and over again around transportation, and the way that that was a through line for so many of the biographies. Again, figures that I thought I knew something about, but that was a familiar feeling. In reading this book, figures that I thought I knew something about, like I didn't know that Harriet Jacobs, fought to have a school for refugees. I know her as an author, right? So I wish, could you say a little bit about the role that biography, because this is a bit of a new, I don't associate your work thus far so much with biography. And so biography is doing a lot of work here for you. I wondered if in some ways you weren't writing a scholarly version of Brown's, what is the name of that wonderful book?
Homespun Heroines. Well, I'm super inspired by Hallie Quinn Brown's 1926 Homespun Heroines. I think a lot of us are, because she is, that for me is really the, a modest but important counter to the history of women's suffrage, which has so... Yeah, and really, speaking back to that in an important way. But, in African-American women's history, I think biography is a central genre rather than the sort of marginal or late career genre that it might be in other subfields. And so in many ways, I think of myself as someone who sort of came of age with biography as a principal way in which Black women's historians have insisted on countering the invocation of Black women sort of either incidentally or instrumentally or symbolically, right? That's, Nell Painter's great biography of Sojourner Truth is that challenge to the myth that is Sojourner Truth. But it turns out Sojourner Truth is hardly the only Black woman who has, in a sense, been relegated to myth and gets picked up and put down, conveniently. So partly biography for me is out of that tradition in my field, and is a way to insist that that there is a project still about regarding Black women, in the fullness of their humanity, and not as symbols. At the same time, this is a book that is aimed at, the hagiography You know, and I've been accused of hagiography in this book. It's okay. It is aimed at the hagiography, right, that I think still pervades so much of the history of women's rights and women's suffrage. And so hard to do that through social history, at least for me. And I'm here to give you a new pantheon of women who I unabashedly and unapologetically admire and think are unsung heroines in this nation's history. So I might have written a social history of this subject. We need more of them, and I know people like Liette Gidlow are at work on precisely those kinds of studies. But for me, I thought nothing short of biography would do, especially in this anniversary year. And if folks take away one or two figures that they hadn't yet encountered or they didn't know, I would consider my work to have been well done.
Yeah, well, there's so many. And we actually have a question, getting back sort of to the question of hagiography. Someone wanted you to expand on what did end up happening with the suffrage monument in Central Park, and whether or not you thought adding Sojourner Truth was a good solution. What would you say finally to people who thought they should have rethought the design fundamentally?
I would say more power to you. I'm a historian. I don't design monuments. That's really important to say. And which means that I don't have a thorough or deeply sophisticated way of telling this story figuratively in bronze, you know, on a granite plinth. I do not, which doesn't mean I don't get to weigh in and be a part of the debates. But I really, I have been, how can I put it, up close and personal with a number of monumental projects in this year. And I have been fascinated to talk with sponsors, with artists, with community folks, and be part of those conversations. But I'm not sure that any monument would satisfy someone like me, whether it's in the minutia, right? Sojourner Truth, is she sitting down or standing up? Is she in mid-sentence? Is she listening? You know, all that was part of the debate. I could think about that all day, but I don't think that's where my strength lies. But I do, of course, as so many of us do, have a profound sense of the stakes in a monument, many monuments, including this one. And I'm working with my students this semester on, we're just in the midst of taking tours of various American cities and the monuments to women's suffrage. And, you know, there's fascinating. I visited last year St. Paul, Minnesota, where they abandoned the figurative model and went to something much more conceptual, because there were too many women and they weren't willing to do the kind of amputation that was required in the Central Park example. The National Portrait Gallery is in the midst, I think probably they've finalized now a permanent monument to American women that will be installed on, I don't remember if it's the F Street or the G Street side of the building, on one of the vacant plinths there. That proposal was for 7 women. Well, you can imagine that was an impossible, that too was impossible. So I have deep admiration for folks who do this, and I think it's an imperfect art. And to me, you know, can't hold a candle to, I don't know, 120,000 words between the covers, but that's because that's what I do.
Yeah, no. So we have a question from our graduate assistant, Nikita Shepard, who asks, if you would speak a little bit about how figures like Pauli Murray, who challenged gender and sexual norms and fought to expand women's social and political opportunities, did so despite their fraught relationship to the category of woman.
Yeah.
And are there new directions in gender, trans studies, et cetera, that can impact how we think about the history of Black women?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I just did an event with the Pauli Murray Center and got to talk with them about this question. And you know that Murray has received, you know, full-length life and times treatment now from your colleague, Roz Rosenberg. I begin with young Murray precisely in that moment where she is wrestling and experimenting with her gender identity. And you'll recall, perhaps, that she is Jim Crowed on a bus ride on her way home to visit family in North Carolina. And part of the texture of that confrontation is that initially Murray is taken for a young man rather than a young woman. And for me, that's an important, if you will, stage setting for what in my book is the most illuminating moment, perhaps, of her long and fascinating life. And it is when she's ordained to the ministry in the Episcopal Church much later in life. Why is that important? Because it's important for the arc of the book, because I've begun with Jarena Lee and struggles over women's authority in the church. And Murray not only wrestles with those things in real time, she frames her reflections about her ordination precisely in that long arc of history. But as importantly, Murray by then offers up a kind of, I don't know if you think resolution is too strong a word, but I think it's something close to a resolution of the lifelong dilemma that she and many queer women faced as part of Black women's politics, civil rights politics, and more. You know, for Murray, her ordination is a kind of moment of transcendence, a moment in which all the parts of her make sense, and which all of the, I think in Christian parlance, right, all the man-made differences, right, that fracture our lives, fracture our politics, and more, are resolved for Murray. And I see that as one essential way of, in a sense, resolving the dilemma that women like Jarena Lee and in a 20th century sort of manifestation of how Black women resolve the dilemmas and the tensions that women like Jarena Lee have been struggling with since the early 19th century. And for Murray, it comes through faith, and it comes through the metaphor of transcendence. She's one example of how that happens, but part of what I'm interested in at the end of the book is precisely how Black women come to not only understand themselves, but make themselves distinctly legible to a body politic and more that has long deemed them to be unthinkable, confounding, and more. So I hope that's helpful, and thank you very much. I guess the historiographic answer is, I think one of the things that an anniversary of this amendment in 2020 has allowed for and made possible is a deep engagement with queer history, queer histories, and the histories of the women's suffrage movement, so that in a more nuts and bolts way of answering your question is that we know a great deal more about the intimate lives, the complex gender identities and more of suffragists, I think, than we ever did. And the anniversary has permitted us to really hold that history up importantly. I think it will remain with us as a permanent part of how we think about certainly many of the leading suffragists.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask a question of Professor Jones while we're still together here for a few more minutes. One of the things I wondered, if it sort of flows from what you were discussing while we're waiting, I don't know, Sam, if you wanted to interject. I had one more thing. You look like you were.
There was a question. I don't know if we got to Caitlin Hong's question or not. Perhaps there was a moment where I did have to duck out for a minute, so maybe it was then.
Yes, we did.
Okay, I'm sorry. Never mind.
I mean, we didn't get to all of it. She addressed the major points just about it. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Now I'm just reading this. I mean, there's a second bit that we did not actually. I did not read to. What ideas about the obligations and entitlements of citizenship did organizations like the NAACW advance in their investment in voting as political activism? And were they different than white suffragists beyond just including Black women?
Yeah.
And then parenthetically, it says, I'm intrigued by Stephen Hahn's suggestion in A Nation Under Our Feet that there is a distinct Black political tradition organized around separatism, collective rights, and nationalism, and would love to hear your thoughts on this with respect to Black women's ideals.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could just, I brought that, and I'm sorry that I forgot that we'd answer the first part, but also I wanted to add to that. Also, maybe specifically, maybe if you could also maybe reflect a bit about Black women's political traditions and perhaps maybe how that has, our failure to understand those is linked to our failure, our meaning the general country, failure to recognize what Black female leadership is and failure to really recognize it as such. That, you know, why is it that in 2020, we still have to remind people that it was Black women who turned Alabama, what was it, a couple of years ago, right? That why it seems that in an election year, we're always chasing this unicorn called the undecided voter, which, let's be honest, is just kind of racialized code for undecided white voter, who probably isn't undecided at all. But that we don't really understand like what Black women's leadership is and how important it is. So I'm proud. This is probably more an exercise of co-opting Caitlin's question a little bit as well. So I apologize to Caitlin.
Oh, that's okay. I guess one thing to say in response to Caitlin's version of the question, if I could, is just, you know, that Vanguard is a history that tacks pretty close to, okay, I'm going to lose the sailing metaphor, but you know what I mean. It runs close to the thread that is party politics, voting rights, citizenship as one's relationship to the state. That is one thread in a much more interesting and roiling scene of Black women's politics just across the 20th century, which is to say that there are moments in which I'm able to signal importantly, right, that there are Black women for whom this is not their political vision. This is not the ways in which they organize. I write just a little bit about New York suffragists who turn away from suffrage politics, I think in part because of the anti-Black racism that runs through women's suffrage organizations and the untenable confrontations with, frankly, overbearing white suffragists. I read about women who become Garveyites and move into a framework that is Pan-African in its vision, that is rooted in economic autonomy, in independence, rather than in party politics. Now, Garvey women are interested in suffrage, and so it's not to suggest that these are separate strains. But this is a book about one strain of Black women's politics, and it, I hope, is a useful companion, to the important work emerging, the long tradition of writing about Black women's radical politics, more broadly, Black women's internationalism, and more. One of the funny things about writing this book, and in a way why I could write it, frankly nobody else I think wanted to, is that I think this take on Black women's politics is really not where the center of the field is at all. And that if you speak about Black women's politics, particularly in the 20th century, I think the best work and the most sort of roiling debates are about Black women's radical politics, left politics, however you want to frame it, internationalism. And so there are many ways in which this book, I hope, is a useful companion to that, but it's not a substitute for that really important work. As for your question, Sam, partly I write this book because I'm tired of people, and even people I know and love, regarding someone like Stacey Abrams as if she's a unicorn, as if she came out of nowhere. My goodness, all you have to do is actually listen to Stacey Abrams, and she's very forthcoming in invoking the Black women's political traditions out of which she comes, as she understands herself. So part of the problem, if I could term it a problem that you're pointing to, excuse me, part of what you're pointing to is that, we don't listen to Black women, right? We don't actually sort of read them or stay tuned in for their remarks, because Black women understand that they are illegible. And so oftentimes go out of their way to help, the American body politic writ large, situate them. They've been doing that a very long time. And your word, I think, was leadership. And isn't that the hardest thing of all? It is the hardest thing in this book for church women. It is the hardest thing for women in civil rights organizations. It is the hardest thing for Black women in anti-slavery societies, in those spaces that they share with men, in the Black conventions and the colored conventions of the 19th century. It is leadership. It is the degree to which women aspire to call the shots, and to, in fact, lead other folks, including men. That is some of the hardest moments, right? So I write about Black churches where there are roiling debates about women's church authority, and what almost destroys Black Methodist churches at the end of the 19th century is that moment when Black women now look to be ordained to the ministry, and the men realize that what being ordained to the ministry means is that women will now have authority over men, in ways grand and in ways every day. And that is provocative. So I think that sort of internally, if you will, within Black politics, I think that tension still persists. And well, I guess we're going to see in a few weeks sort of how this country wrestles with the imagination, the possibility, not simply the imagining, right, but the possibility that it might be led, importantly, by a Black American woman. I think that's not the same puzzle as the one the nation faced in 2008 when a Black man ran for high office. I'd be curious what you think, but.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to make head tails right now. Let's
Mhm.
circle back. Let's circle
Well,
back in maybe a month or so. We'll see what we think. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, well, I think the debate showed that, that it is a different challenge for Kamala Harris. That the resort to the kind of, as you show so beautifully in this book over and over again, that the right to speech and free speech and the power to, assume the pulpit and, take up power really literally in that way is at the heart of this intellectual tradition. And, we saw a graphic example. We all know as a prosecutor, she could have made mincemeat of her opponent in that debate. We've seen her do it in other arenas, but we knew that she wasn't going to do it in that arena.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought one of the things your book did, among many, many things, that you did so well and so lightly was infuse the whole question of performance and the politics of respectability. And I say that as performance because it's another sort of, to my mind, debunking of the myth. These women always knew that wasn't for them, right? It was always this kind of, self-aware performance of something that they knew didn't protect them. And, by the end, when you give us Fannie Lou Hamer with her soul style, right, and this very different performance, to me, that was also just a beautiful example of what's changed by 1964, right,
Mm-hmm.
when she goes to the Democratic National Convention. There were really just, Martha, so many moments like that for me of people that were familiar, but I did see them in their humanity, right? In this larger argument about, a politics based really on humanity, and not single issues or, the lived experience of intersectionality going way, way back.
Yeah. And it's connected to, I think, it's another way to think about Caitlin's question and Sam's question, that the women I write about, there are many, you're always looking for keywords, especially when you're writing across, 200 years, you're trying to discover the threads that can hold it together. And keywords are one of the things, language is one of the things that do that. And I expected Black women to be speaking about equality. I think that was sort of the inherited wisdom. But there were two other terms that turned out to be incredibly important. One was dignity, right? And that goes to the problem of the ladies' car and assault and sexual assault and more. If Black women aren't looking simply to be equal, right? They are looking to claim a kind of standing and regard and more that they call dignity. And the other word was humanity. And I thought, why do these Black women keep speaking about humanity? Which they are by the 1860s, talking in that kind of ambitious, perhaps overblown, but really ambitious language. And so it helped me to appreciate that partly this is a politics that is not about women's politics at all, though women's politics are necessary to get to the goal, right? That Black women actually think, believe, work through a vision that says, if I can lift myself up, right, everyone will be lifted up, right? That if I can unburden, right, us as a nation from the problem of racism and the problem of sexism, right, this is a different country for everyone. And I think that, even today, I've been thinking about, Senator Harris and not the debate, but I've been thinking about the hearings around the Supreme Court nomination and how the Democratic Party has leaned on heavily on the future, the prospect of the full undercutting of the Affordable Care Act. And I said, so why is it so hard for us to appreciate that the Affordable Care Act is a Black women's issue, right? That for Black women, right? That is how Black women think about politics and vision, right? That an Affordable Care Act redounds importantly, right, to the interest of Black people, of Black women, of Black families. Yes, right. But it is not, you know, the Black Women's Affordable Care Act. And the women I write about are always working, right, with that kind of ambition all the time. And so I don't think like the Equal Rights Amendment is what they would have done next if they had not been so preoccupied with, you know, continuing to struggle around voting rights after 1920. I don't know that I think that's what Black women would have done next. I think that might have been, in a way, too narrow, even as it is ambitious in other ways. It was too narrow in others.
I mean, to me, that was one of the lessons I kept getting from your book politically over and over again, was the danger of single issue politics. You know, I just felt like that's something that they don't, your political actors don't ever really make that mistake. Well, we thank you so much for joining us today, Martha, and for speaking with us about this tremendous book, and for publishing it this year when we all really needed it to do the kind of intervention that it's done in our culture. So thank you from us all for that too.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Martha. Be safe.
Yeah, thanks everybody. You be well too. I look forward to seeing you the next time.